Olá, boa noite. Começamos a parceria com o TIFA pensando na Grada Quilomba, a quem não conseguimos chegar usando nossas próprias redes. Sabíamos que ter Grada Quilomba em nossa programação seria fundamental em um ano em que a grande pauta foram as manifestações antirracistas que se seguiram ao assassinato de George Floyd. Precisávamos da voz dela para entender se, a partir de agora, maio de 2020, ocupa um lugar na história tão relevante quanto um maio de 1968, a Primavera Árabe, ou a queda do Muro de Berlim. Depois de ouvi-la, temos a certeza de que sim. Também tínhamos interesse em apresentar os poetas LGBTQI+, que reunimos no nosso Slam Queer. Não foi pequeno o esforço que fizemos para traduzir os 96 poemas das 16 pessoas envolvidas na batalha que organizamos no último fim de semana. Entendemos como uma das vocações da Flup criar pontes entre as narrativas periféricas e o mundo, principalmente no momento em que o Brasil se encontra tão isolado. Já fizemos isso por intermédio de nossas publicações. E agora procuramos parcerias com festivais, criando uma via de mão dupla, em que recebemos autores internacionais e mandamos autores nacionais para falar lá fora. Vale lembrar que, desde sempre, a ideia de periferia, para nós, nunca esteve restrita ao território. Há corpos periféricos também. Laurence Hill foi o presente inesperado dessa parceria. O autor do Livro dos Negros, aclamado romance que se tornou também uma aclamada série televisiva, demonstrou interesse em falar para o segundo maior país negro do mundo. Sentimos-nos particularmente honrados por ser o primeiro festival nacional a acolher um dos autores negros mais importantes da atualidade. O interesse do TIFA era tê-lo em seu programa, compartilhando esse debate que certamente será histórico. A demandada agenda de Laurence Hill terminou atuando a nosso favor. Com vocês, o extraordinário Laurence Hill, do também extraordinário Livro dos Negros. Vamos lá?
Hello, my name is Roland Gulliver, and I'm the director of the Toronto International Festival of Authors. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event, which sees Laurence Hill in conversation with Damon d'Oliveira. Laurence Hill is one of Canada's foremost writers and a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph in Ontario. He's the author of 10 books of fiction and non-fiction. In 2005, he won his first literary honour, a National Magazine Award for the article Is Africa's Pain Black America's Burden, which was published in The Walrus. His first two novels were Some Great Thing and Any Known Blood, but it was his third novel, The Book of Negroes, published in 2007, that attracted widespread attention in Canada and around the world. The Book of Negroes won several awards, including the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, both CBC Canada Reads, and Radio-Canada's Le Combat des Livres, and the Commonwealth Writers Prize. His notable non-fiction titles include Blood, The Stuff of Life, which inspired the 2013 Massey Lectures, and Dear Sir, I Intend to Burn Your Book, An Anatomy of a Book Burning. And his fourth novel, The Illegal, was published by HarperCollins Canada in 2015. Laurence will be in conversation with Damon d'Oliveira, a Canadian actor and film and television producer. He is also a co-partner in the production company Conquering Lion Pictures, a dynamic independent Canadian production company based in Toronto. Damon produced the television series The Book of Negroes, a 6-part adaptation which won 12 Canadian Screen Awards in 2016, a TV Critics Award, and the NAACP Award for Best Miniseries. Co-written by Hill and Clement Virgo, and starring Anjanou Ellis and Cuba Gooding Jr., it debuted to record breaking numbers on CBC in Canada in January 2015, and July 2020 saw its re-release. This event is presented in partnership with the Flup Festival in Rio de Janeiro. That is the literature festival of urban peripheries, which takes place in Brazil in October and November. And we've been working together in this new digital world to share events and ideas. So I'd like to thank Julio Ludimir, my fellow director at Flup, for all his energy and inspiration in helping make this happen. So on behalf of Tifa and Flup, we really hope you enjoy this very special presentation.
Welcome everyone to the 41st edition of the Toronto International Festival of Authors, Canada's largest and longest running literary festival. My name is Damon d'Oliveira. I'll be engaging in today's interview with the wonderful Lawrence Hill, Canada's sort of national gem, African-Canadian novelist, and wonderful collaborator of mine over the last 7 years. I met Lawrence first when I was actually hired to do a radio recording of his first novel, Some Great Thing, for the CBC Books stream. And I knew from that initial reading that Larry was going to have a long career as a writer. Our paths, luckily, have continued to intertwine ever since. And I'm looking forward to having a casual and candid conversation with you today, Larry.
Thank you, Damon.
Today is November 4th.
What a day.
What a day. Did you sleep last night?
I did sleep. I watched the TV news about the U.S. election for a few hours, and then I just couldn't take it anymore. And I just thought, to hell with this. For one thing, the results aren't definitive. And for another thing, I just can't stomach it anymore because it's too damn painful. And so I went to bed knowing that I have a little bit more information in the morning. And I know we're going to have to wait a few days. But I like to be funny about this too, but it's pretty depressing.
It is. It is. I mean, I find myself asking, how do we end up here? You know, I remember the elation that I felt the night that Obama won the presidency in 2008. I just happened to be in Los Angeles at the time. And I feel like this time around, I just felt anxiety for like the last week and a half, I think, you know. How do we end up like this, Larry? What do you think?
I'm not even an American. I mean, my parents were Americans who came to Canada after they married, the day after, and most of my family lives in the States, except for my wife and children and brother. But apart from that, all my family's in the States. But I'm not American. I don't have American citizenship. But I feel this as if it were right lodged inside my bone marrow, and it's hard to watch. How do we end up like this? I don't know. I guess it's easier to peddle xenophobia and hatred than it is to peddle decency and democracy. It's easier to sometimes, if you're a skilled manipulator of human emotion, as Trump is, easier to peddle hatred and xenophobia than other things. And I suppose that's what leads to the rise of Nazi Germany and other things as well. So it worries me profoundly.
Yeah. I mean, I think the waiting process is really hard on everyone because for some people, it feels like they've been waiting for 4 years for this moment, you know?
Yeah, waiting for 4 years, and we knew better, but clearly American voters don't feel the same way, many of them at least, don't feel the same way I do, and they're solidly behind Trump, so it's worrisome.
Well, Larry, your dad was from one of the battleground states, from Georgia, right?
My dad actually was born in Independence, Missouri, but because his father was an itinerant minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, they moved every few years. So my dad was born in Missouri, then lived in Colorado, and then in Oregon, and then in California, right up until he was drafted into the Army in the Second World War. So he grew up a little bit all over the states, but born in Missouri.
Wow. How did he and your mom end up coming to Canada, to Don Mills, Toronto?
It's a great story, and I know your parents were immigrants too from Guyana, which is fascinating similarities, and also a multiracial component just like mine. But my parents married interracially, black father, white mother, in Washington, D.C. in 1953, and it was impossible to live as an interracial couple in D.C. or in the South, at the time. I mean, even telephone booths and federal government cafeterias were still segregated, water fountains, everything. And so they had to leave. So they left the next day and drove to Canada and lived there ever after until they passed away and became very engaged civil rights activists in Canada. My mother had already been doing that in the States in the late 40s and early 50s, but she sort of moved her passions in terms of civil rights onto Canadian soil, as did my father, when they married and moved. So that's how they came. And I think they were so tired of racial politics and so tired of being reminded every day, in my father's case, that he was black, and in my mother's case, that she was white, and they were together, that they moved to like the whitest suburb of all of Canada, Don Mills, which is kind of like a middle class, a new Canadian suburb in the city of Toronto. And I was growing up in the early 1960s. And so they moved to this place that seemed to have no knowledge or register about issues of blackness or black identity. So I had to sort of forge it as a writer because it wasn't coming to me on the streets of Don Mills.
Oh yeah, and I grew up like, one borough over from there in Scarborough. By the time I landed in Scarborough, things had progressed a little bit more, but still, I remember having to endure a lot of epithets that were sort of thrown my way when I was in early years of high school. Let's talk a little bit about the notion of growing up biracial and how that has sort of entered into your writing. It's definitely something that has sort of woven its way through a lot of your books. So do you want to maybe sort of unpack that?
Sure. And it's funny because I mean, I was born in 1957, so I'm growing up in Toronto in the early 60s, and the word biracial didn't even sort of exist in our vocabularies, in the early 1960s. Canadians, and I know you've experienced this too, Damon, they seem to have, especially back then, so little sophistication when it came to understanding blackness or racial identity or mixed racial identity. And so the odd thing for me was that it seemed like half the time, or maybe even 3/4 of the time, I just wander around and do my ordinary things like be in a chess club or be on the track team, or play hockey or baseball, all sorts of normal, boring things in a debating club. And then I would sort of think of myself as the same as everybody else. And then suddenly, wham, something would come along and just shock me out of that, like being called the N-word, or something would happen that would just drive me immediately into a whole other sphere of identity, whether I liked it or not. It would just come zinging out of nowhere. And then things would kind of return to normal, and I'd function kind of thinking that I was like other kids, and 4 days or 16 days later, boom, it would happen again. And so there was something about the irregularity of it that was very destabilizing, and people didn't seem to know what to make of me. I understand that you experienced something a little bit similar, Damon, and people not necessarily knowing what to make of you either as a young immigrant from Guyana.
No, I had a very similar experience, and I think we were lucky to have a couple of teachers in our high school that were incredible sort of sources of inspiration, and we had this phenomenal class of young, inclined to do drama and the sort of creative arts, who were just totally encouraged to chase dreams at a young age in high school. And I think it's that old cliche of having like one teacher that can affect change. In my class, we had Eric McCormack, who became Will on Will and Grace, and David Furnish, who's the partner of Elton John and sort of running the Rocket Enterprises right now. And we were these like suburban kids that kind of came through like a non-art school, but there was a kind of inspiration that was there through a couple of teachers that really sort of led us. What was your gang in high school? Like, were you a loner? I have a lot of friends that are writers that kind of didn't belong to cliques. It felt like in our high school, it was just like a high school loaded with cliques. And we were definitely the outcasts, our clique.
Well, I was never a cool kid. I mean, I was a very intense runner, trying to make it to the Olympics, and as a middle distance runner, 1,500 meters, 5,000 meters, cross country, that kind of thing. So I didn't have the body to go with the will or the training. So I didn't make my dream at all. And out of the burned up ashes of my Olympic dream, emerged my life as a writer. But I ran a lot. I was very studious. I had friends, but I wasn't like a popular kid or in a cool group. And I went to school in downtown Toronto, right at Bloor and Spadina, a school that was inside the University of Toronto community. So it was a University of Toronto high school.
Yeah.
And it was a really strange place to go. I was the only Black kid or kid of mixed race, in my grade, or I think in the entire school for most of the years I was there. There was one other Black kid who was a few years ahead of me who graduated and left, before I really got cemented in the school. So it was very alienating. And some of the teachers were just, unlike yours, were just absolutely atrocious. Others were very good. But so it was, but every time I kind of encountered, say even a racist insult from one of my teachers, it would cement in me a further sense of Blackness and a Black identity. Because it would sort of drive home the point, no matter what you do, Larry, you ain't becoming white. That's not going to happen. It's never going to be accepted. It's not a possibility. So you might as well engage with and accept and make something of your Blackness, because the whiteness is not really going to be possible.
And is that what led you to want to articulate the experience as a writer?
Well, I mean, my brother Dan became a singer-songwriter, and my late sister Karen also wrote a great deal in poetry, creative nonfiction and fiction. And I think we were all, trying to make sense of this kind of racial crucible, growing up in Don Mills with only occasional flirtation with Black culture when we'd have family gatherings or occasional gatherings with my father's friends who lived here, there, and everywhere in the city. But on a day-to-day basis, it was white culture, except when we were suddenly infused with Black culture. And it's such a weird thing to go from being in an entirely Black surrounding one day to being back inside Don Mills, on a hockey team or something the next day. I almost felt fraudulent moving, between those worlds. But I think I became a writer to make sense of that. And the very ambiguity about my own identity is probably what drove me and brother Dan and sister Karen to become writers. And in Dan's case, singer-songwriter, to make sense of something that was so confusing and so ambiguous.
Right. And so your sort of early writing was as a journalist. And I'm kind of curious to know how you got your start as a journalist. What was the impetus to do that?
Well, I was writing fiction from avidly writing short stories from the age of 14. And I had my mother's L.C. Smith manual typewriter, which I still have here at home. I was writing short stories, ripping them up, writing them again, showing them to my mother, who'd tell me how bad they were and rip them up herself verbally and send me back to the drawing board. So I had my mother to sort of coach me. She was very good with words and on the page. And so I was writing a lot. But once I finished university, I did a degree in economics at a French university in Canada called Université Laval in Quebec City. After that, I needed a job. I needed something to support myself. And so I became a journalist, since there were a few other things I was qualified to do. And so I just started writing, for the Globe and Mail and then for the Winnipeg Free Press as a daily newspaper reporter. To get those jobs, I just built up a portfolio of freelance writing. I submitted a bunch of stuff to small papers and magazines, and eventually they felt the portfolio was strong enough to allow me, to work at those places. So I didn't have any training in journalism, but a lot of people back then didn't. They just jumped into the job. And
so out of your writing, it felt like your book, Some Great Thing, was very steeped in really specific experiences that you'd had in that world. I'm curious to know how that first novel came about, because it's always it's always a sort of career-defining moment. It's like that for feature film too. You know, as a director, I think a lot of directors are really kind of put into a box almost in some ways by virtue of the first film that they make. So I'm curious to know how that came about for you.
Well, I was writing fiction on the side and working my backside off as a journalist, long hours, you know, often 6 days a week, very long hours, come home exhausted. And I found the writing, once I became a journalist, the creative writing wasn't very good. It sort of lost its humor, it lost its zaniness, it lost its playfulness. I was working at it, but it just lost its zip. And I think it's because I was so exhausted, because I was working so hard and giving everything to the newsroom, that when I came home, you know, after 10 or 11-hour days, I just had nothing left that was really useful as a writer. And so I planned to quit and to go off to Spain, and eventually saved up my money and did that after a few years, and moved off to Spain to see if I had it. Because I remember thinking, I'm 27 years old and I'm getting old.
Yeah,
and I better do something about it before I get too old and wake up bitter at 40 because I never pursued my dreams. And so I better do something about it now because I'm getting old. So I quit my job and just moved to Spain, and just for the first time in my life, for about 1.25 years, just wrote every day, all day, didn't have any other responsibilities except to make food for myself and go for a run. And just wrote and wrote and wrote to see if I had it. I needed to find out. So when I came back from Spain after 1.25 years of writing daily, all day, I felt that I had it and that I could make this my life. So I just started working on the first novel, Some Great Thing, which is a novel about a Black journalist, as you know, Damon, first year on the job for a fictional newspaper in Winnipeg. It explores issues of racism, but also poverty, and also an incredibly intense bigotry against French-speaking Manitobans, which I encountered as a journalist when I was reporting there. And so it's a novel that sort of explores social injustice on various layers, and tries to do so with kind of a cutting, occasionally comic edge.
Oh yeah, and there's interesting romances that are sort of woven through that narrative as well.
Got to have romance in fiction.
We'll get to romance in the Book of Negroes as well, because that was a big shift, I think, in going to the adaptation. But so from there, you went on to write a second novel called Any Known Blood. And I'm wondering about that transition from first novel to second novel, because again, in feature film, that can sometimes be a real hurdle for emerging filmmakers who've had great success with a first feature. They sometimes call it the curse of the sophomore film.
Yes, and they talk about novels that way too. But maybe in retrospect, it's a good thing that my first novel, although I was proud of it, and I still am proud of it, it was a total flop commercially. I mean, it might have sold 300 copies in the first year. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I doubt it sold more than 300 copies in the first year, or even 1,000 copies, you know, in its first 8 years. So it was a very, very, it was a novel that got a little bit of attention from a few people, especially in the Black community, but it was, you know, it went nowhere, and nobody noticed it, and nobody reviewed it, and nobody bought it except for family members and a few friends. And so the second, in a way, that's a good thing, because I didn't have to worry about the curse of the sophomore novel, because my sophomore novel entered the world as if it were my first, because so little attention had been paid to the first novel. And it did much better. It didn't set the world on fire, but it's a novel about 5 generations of a Black family that moves back and forth between Baltimore and a small town in Ontario called Oakville. And very few people know this, but Oakville was a terminus, an endpoint in the Underground Railroad, bringing Black fugitive slaves, you know, into Canada in the early to mid 1800s. And so other cities are known as termini of the Underground Railroad, but Oakville was a small one. And so I have this family over 5 generations moving between Baltimore and Oakville. Each generation leaves its country and goes to the next one. And there's a big love story in each one. And in that novel, thankfully, it caught the attention of a bigger publisher plus an agent, and it got reviewed, and I started getting invited to places, and it wasn't a bestseller or anything like that, but it definitely was a big step up in the market for me, and it earned me much more attention and respect and interest and invitations and the like. So it opened the door a lot.
Interesting. And so from writing fiction, you started doing a couple of other novels that were nonfiction, and I'm curious to know about that transition in your sort of trajectory as a writer. Was it to take a break from fiction? Was it something that had been bubbling up as you were writing fiction, and you were concerned about the form, whether it could contain the ideas that you wanted to put into your next novels? How did that transition go for you?
I think there's a few things. One is that few writers, unless they're like extraordinarily successful and rich with the royalties, can afford to just do one kind of writing. And so the fact that I was writing fiction and nonfiction and occasional works of journalism still, and in some speech writing and then into film later, those are, I think, very natural things that writers do. Partly it's a financial necessity. You have to do a little bit of everything just to keep going and stay alive. But also it's stimulating creatively not to always have to work in the same mode. And because I had a journalism background, it always seemed easy for me to write nonfiction. And so I wanted to write a story about growing up Black and white in Canada and exploring the nature of mixed race identity and how racial identity comes to be developed and construed. And or as Archie Bunker might have said, misconstrued. But I started to explore that, and no Canadian book at the time by a single author had ever really examined Black and white identity through the lens of one author's experiences. And I've always found that Canadians have been loath to discuss issues of identity, and almost it feels like a dirty subject to touch it. There's something wrong with you to even go there, people feel. And so there was a lot to be said. And for the first time in my life, not wanting just to write about myself, I started to interview other Canadians, about 34 other Canadians who, like me, had one Black and one white parent. And it was a fascinating journey to just go ask intimate, personal questions like, how do you do your hair? What were your dating preferences? When did you first become conscious of your racial identity? And interview 34 people across the country, from BC to Halifax and Whitney Point in Sydney and other old Black communities in the east of Canada. So it was sort of a mixed bag of memoir, defining how I came to develop a sense of Blackness, but also recounting the experiences of other people who told me about things like how they did their hair, what kind of barber they went to or hairdresser, what their dating preferences were, how they began to see themselves, and how that evolved over time. And so it was just a very intimate nonfiction reflection. And I continued to move back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. And why not? I mean, sometimes one thing comes to you and wants to be expressed one way, and another thing another way. I'll give one other example, and that is that in the novel, Any Known Blood, I had a scene that was loosely based on a true story in which the Ku Klux Klan comes to intimidate a Black man who plans to marry a white woman in Oakville and burns down a cross outside his house, threatens his life. Later on, his own house is burned down, and this guy is prevented from being able to marry his white fiance in Oakville because of the Klan. He ends up marrying her on a Six Nations reserve, outside of Toronto, so I wrote about that fictionally, but afterward I felt that I should have explored it more deeply and really explored the actual story. So I came back and then I wrote a long chapter about it accurately, as a journalist in Blackberry Sweet Juice. So I wanted to dig into the factual background more fully and really explore the issues, which you can't do quite as much in something like a novel. So sometimes something that I've explored in a novel, I will come back to and write about it non-fictionally in another book or feature article.
Great. I think that, again, your experience as a writer is so, it just has come so directly from your experience, your sort of personal experience. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Brazil, given that we've sort of, we're being co-sponsored by the Brazilian Festival of Authors. So in conversations in the past, you've sort of had these fancy imaginings of going to Brazil because it is such a racially complicated society, compared, say, to North America. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's funny because I've had a chance to live and work in various countries in French West Africa and also in Swaziland, and I've had a chance to live in the United States, and I've lived in various countries in Europe and around Canada, but I'm sorry to say that I've never been to Brazil. I'd love to go, but I've never been invited or never had the opportunity to go. But I've had a lifelong recurring dream about Brazil, and I think it's rooted in the notion of my own mixed race identity and in knowing how profoundly that is a fact of life in Brazil too. And in the dream, I've done something wrong, as always happens, some amorphous wrong that I've committed in my dream. I never know what that wrong was. And as a result of committing some wrong in my home country, I've been exiled to Brazil. And I have to start all my life all over again. And I even make a calculated decision, which is kind of funny, but I'll never get good enough in Portuguese to write as a novelist in Brazil. So I'm just going to take it one step down. And I'm going to try to make it as a journalist in Brazil, because I probably can get good enough in Portuguese to write as a successful journalist in writing in Portuguese, but I probably won't make it as a novelist. So I take it down a step and decide to make it as a journalist immigrant, to Brazil. And this is, my life starts all over again. And I even have to ask myself questions like, romantically, do my values, do my standards change if I'm just all alone in a country where nobody knows me? How does that affect the kind of partner I might want to be with if I should have so much luck as to find a partner? And so it's just this kind of weird speculative dream about my whole life moving to Brazil, but I've never been. I'm honored to be part of the Flup Festival here with you, Damon, and perhaps one day, especially now that the Book of Negroes is published as a novel in Brazil, perhaps one day I'll have a chance to get to that country when it's safe to travel again in the world.
One of the things that I've really admired about you is that you have really developed almost like a rabid fan base. You do a lot of work with your fans. Have you had outreach from Brazil? Do you have a sense of how your work lands in Brazil?
I don't have much. Occasionally I get letters from people in Brazil, but funny, I can still pretty well read Portuguese without too much trouble, because with French and Spanish it's so easy to figure out a language such as Portuguese. But occasionally I get a letter from a fan, but I can't pretend to really know how the work is taken up or how people see it in Brazil. I guess I'll have to get there one day, as you have. I know, Damon, you've traveled to Brazil.
Yeah, I love that country. I've been there twice. My father's family is originally Portuguese from Madeira, and there was a lot of migration that happened, I think, in the early 1900s down to the Caribbean and into Brazil. And going there, I've been to Rio and Sao Paulo, and it's amazing how much like home it feels. And Guyana's next door to Brazil, but they're two different places culturally. But it really did have a familiarity about it and a kind of ease around race and the notion of being Black in the context of Brazil. I know there is a sense of colorism that exists there, as it does in the Caribbean as well. But it just feels like that culture is somehow more embedded. There's more history there of that, of being mixed race or biracial. And there was a kind of ease that I really loved in the little time that I spent down in Brazil. Let's talk a little bit about how you've nurtured a fan base, because I'd love to transition to talking about the Book of Negroes. And certainly when I heard about the Book of Negroes, it was about probably a year after it had been officially published. I was aware of it as a title, And both myself and my partner, Clement Virgo at Conquering Lion, before we optioned it, there was a little bit of trepidation. It was, a title that has a lot of heft to it. And, neither of us ran out to pick it up right away. And through a really interesting connection with Molly Johnson, I think, who ran into Clement at a bookstore and made him buy it, we both read it within a weekend, I think 3 days or 4 days. And it was an incredible story. It was profoundly moving. It was cinematic. It was, it was a Canadian epic. And we kind of fell in love with the character of Aminata. And when we started talking about it, we were initially thinking, how do we take this huge 500-page novel and respect it, but sort of pare it down to its essence? And we started thinking about it as a feature film. And I remember we had to come and meet you to sort of pitch you on our idea. And Clement and I had talked about this for a couple of weeks about what was that pitch going to be. And literally in the car drive on the way to Burlington, where you had your little writing office set up, we sort of realized that this is a story that's very similar to The Wizard of Oz. And I know, The Wizard of Oz is sort of like this classic, but it really is a story about a young woman who gets sucked up into a maelstrom, which is slavery. And all she wants to do through the course of that book is find her way home. And I'm curious to sort of, we've never really talked about how that landed with you. I guess it was an okay pitch because you let us have the rights to adapt your book. Was it strange for you to sort of have your material taken by creative collaborators and suddenly shaped in a different way?
No, it wasn't strange at all. It felt like an incredibly beautiful and ennobling process, and it came at a really great time in my life as I was struggling creatively to find my sea legs and to get writing fiction again. And it came at a time that I was spinning my wheels and having some trouble writing new fiction and feeling it would work. And so it gave me a sense of purpose, and I had never before worked closely with other people. And suddenly I found myself working with you, Damon, and with Clement closely and collaborating. It was really exciting. And I knew from the pitch, from our first meeting, that I wanted to very much to do this with you. And it was incredibly exciting. I mean, listen, when somebody who works in another art form, in your case, in Clement's case, is filmmakers, shows an interest in your work, it's one of the world's greatest compliments when to get an interest in your work from somebody who works in another artistic field. And but it was more than just a compliment. It was a really exciting way for me to learn and to engage and to do something new. And heaven knows we all need new stimulation in life, and we don't stop learning at 20 or 30. And so it was really thrilling for me to step in, and I think you did a fantastic job, both of you and everybody you worked with, to make it a successful transition. So no, it wasn't difficult. And obviously there are moments when visions were different, and how it is when you're the writer, your voice is the least definitive among all the voices that might be pitching in between directors and producers and actors and the rest of it. The writer sort of is on the bottom of the totem pole in terms of hierarchy, but still I felt engaged and welcomed, and you always asked my opinion about all sorts of interesting things, even casting. And so it was fun to be part of that, from the ground up, and to help shape it. And the fact that I'd been a journalist helped me kind of relax about the process and not worry that it wasn't going to be a carbon copy of the book, which is impossible because it's got to work in its own terms. So no, it was a very healthy and exciting and stimulating experience. And so I was very, very grateful for it. It added a whole new element of richness to my life.
It was interesting from our perspective because I think we were really mindful of not wanting to change your original narrative too much. We wanted to sort of respect, the book. And what was fascinating in collaborating with you, you you were the first person to say, oh, let's try that. That sounds interesting. You know, let's take Aminata out of there and let's put her over there. I mean, the challenge of a book like that is so much of your writing is sometimes interior monologue where, you know, your character is going through choices or ruminations. And our job as filmmakers is to sort of take that and make it active, especially when you're making it for network television, where you need to have a cliffhanger every 10 minutes. You know, there's that sort of that need to have an active narrative that sort of drives an audience forward. But I feel like there was a lot of that already in the book, and that's why it was such a successful novel to adapt, because they don't always work out, I think, as well as Book of Negroes did. I'm interested to know when you first came up with the idea for the Book of Negroes, how did that process change for you? Like, was there something that you thought you were going to be writing when you first started your research? And then I know that took about 6 or 7 years for you to sort of complete the research, and that's a massive undertaking. I can't imagine, you know, being so deep into history, because so much of it was also getting the history right around the narrative that you were writing. I'm just curious to know, how did things change for you along the way as you were writing?
Well, as usual for me, I didn't really know what I was doing until I started writing, and the writing becomes a kind of tunneling, a kind of exploration in which I'm digging through a long, dark tunnel and trying to find some light at the end of it. And I don't really know how the story is going to work out until I've written a draft or 2 or 3. So for me, writing is a way to find out what my story really is going to become. But I was completely gobsmacked by the discovery that some African Americans who'd been enslaved from Africa and had come to being in bondage in the United States, and had then come over to Canada after serving the British in the American Revolutionary War. They come to Canada, and then they turn around and are treated so badly in Canada, in Nova Scotia, that many of them voluntarily leave and go back to Africa. And I had never, in all of my reading and learning about Black history in Canada and about slavery and the Black experience in the world, never had I heard about enslaved peoples, you know, from Africa who managed to get back to the mother continent in the same lifetime in which they lived. And so that was a really striking discovery that excited me about the idea of writing the book. And I guess the first impetus was, okay, I want to put this woman on a ship, you know, leaving the Halifax harbor in January 1792. Who is she? And why is this woman embarking on a ship leaving Halifax in the winter to go to Africa? Why would she take these risks when she could be caught and re-enslaved as she's traveling across the ocean back to Africa? Why would she do this? Who is she? What's her story? What story can I hang on her shoulders? And so I just started imagining a woman who was on one of those ships leaving Halifax harbor, and what's her life story? How did she get there? Where are her parents? Does she have a lover? Does she have children? Who is this woman? What's the sound of her voice? How does she walk? And I became totally obsessed with kind of fleshing out this character and hanging a story on her shoulders. So she became Aminata Diallo.
And was it a challenge for you when we were going through the adaptation process? You know, there was a pivotal moment where we decided this project was too big to be a feature film, you know, that we had to kind of move from the idea of doing this as 2.5 hours to a 6-hour miniseries. How did you feel at that moment? Like, was that something that you thought, oh, okay, this is going to serve the story better? Because I remember the first draft that we had done of the feature film was very dense. There was a lot of writing, and a lot of the novel had to be kind of pared down, I think. What was your thought about that shift when we went from feature to a 6-part miniseries?
Well, I've always been, I hope, I've always been a pretty practical guy. I'm not some writer who lives in his own dreams, who's disconnected from the realities of the world. And so when the filmmakers you're working with tell you that they can't raise the money to do a feature film, but they believe they will be able to raise it to do a television miniseries. Of course, there was some initial disappointment because I had this idea, which was wrong, that a film would be better, somehow it would be a better thing to have. But that was kind of misinformed and just based on a naive early understanding of how the world of film and TV worked. But when it was presented to me that this was a possibility that could actually be that the thing got made, I thought, okay, hallelujah, let's do it. Let's just pivot and do it. And so it wasn't, it wasn't a big deal. I just felt, okay, fine, let's do that. Let's make it work. Let's see if we can make this happen. So I was okay with it. And really, I didn't know enough about the world of film or TV to really have an informed opinion about to be disappointed or something. I just thought, let's do what we can to make this happen. And it looked like it would happen as you moved into a miniseries, and it did. So I was just grateful. And there's more story, there's more time to work with. We got to expand the story. It was financially rewarding too, to move from one to the other. And so there was really no reason not to embrace it once it was presented to me as really the only way to get the thing done.
Yeah, I think it was a financial decision originally because there was a real struggle to tell a narrative on film. And this was probably going back to 2011, before 12 Years a Slave had actually had its initial release. And, I think this is our challenge making Black content. You kind of have to prove to the marketplace that this thing has value. And, in feature films, we feel like we go through this process every time. You have to struggle so much harder. Yet films come along like 12 Years a Slave and Moonlight all the time that go on to great commercial and critical success.
That's the thing. Same thing in literature. Over and over and over again in my life, I've been told by countless people in the world of books that Black literature won't sell, or that people won't come to Black events, or that if there's a Black author I wanted to celebrate and feature, nobody would bother coming out to it. And it is not just from one person, such as one publisher or one agent, but I just heard this over and over and over again in the first 20 or so years of my career. And so there's this ridiculous perception that if it's Black, it's a Black themed about Black people, it won't sell, which is crazy. And we over and over again, we've seen that some of the most exciting works of film and literature have emerged from racialized communities, historically and in a more contemporary way. And why shouldn't they?
I mean, one of the things I think I was proudest of is that, we were building a Black series with Black creators, and our top 4 actors in the miniseries were Black. And that was a first in Canada. That had never actually been seen before on screen. So I'm still super proud about that.
Me too. And just to add to that, sometimes when we were in South Africa filming not far from Cape Town, I would just look. I mean, I was just there to watch. I had no role, a little bit of supporting role with the screenwriting there in South Africa, but that work was mostly already done. So mostly I was there just to watch and enjoy the filming. And I remember looking at the people working, the cast and the others working the lights and working the sound, and producers of all sorts of different kinds. And I thought, what a wonderful thing it is that this creation has given so much employment to Black people.
Oh, that was an extraordinary thing. And I feel like right now we've kind of paved the way for other projects that are about to happen in Canada on television. I wanted to sort of talk about your desire to tell a different kind of story with The Illegal, which came after the Book of Negroes. We're kind of moving through your career, it feels like, in this conversation, but talk about your inspiration for that, Larry.
Well, my late sister, Karen, used to live in Berlin. She lived in West Berlin when it was still West Berlin, when the Germanys were still divided, from the late 70s until the late 80s, just before the wall came down. And she fell in love with this guy who was a refugee from Sudan, who what would happen to people from who were trying to get over the Berlin Wall. they'd be shot to death. You know, if you're trying to get over the Berlin Wall and get from East Germany into West Germany, I don't know how many people in the course of time were killed as they tried to get over the Berlin Wall. But bizarrely, if you were from East Africa, like Sudan, and you showed up at the Berlin Wall and wanted to cross from East Germany into West Germany, the East Germans say, by all means, keep going. Don't stop here. Just keep on going. And so they would let, I kid you not, I'm serious, they would let East Africans through just so they wouldn't have to deal with them, you know, and have them, you know, among them in East Germany. And so my sister's lover, who ended up becoming her husband, who ended up becoming the father of my beloved niece Malika, was one of those Sudanese refugees who got through the Berlin Wall without being shot, but then ends up in West Berlin with nothing to do, with no real paperwork. You know how hard it is in a country as regimented as Canada or Germany to get a driver's license or to rent an apartment or to even get a library card to get your life going, to work, to be paid legally if you don't have papers. And so his life was a mess. He was constantly living kind of under the radar of legality, you know, in West Berlin. And so watching him and watching other Sudanese refugees in Berlin planted the seed for the novel that became The Illegal, in which I write about a talented, you know, would-be Olympian runner, a marathoner who has to flee his country, which is an island of Black people, a very poor island, a fictional island called Zantoroland. He has to flee it during the rise of genocide aimed at his own people and seek undocumented status, you know, just hide out basically without papers in a rich country not too far away called Freedom State. And so I've been long interested in the plight of undocumented people. And so it kind of gave rise to this novel about this marathon runner who's hiding in a rich country, whose only means of making money to feed himself and to take care of his problems is to enter the occasional road race, scoop up the winnings, and use that for food and rent and other emergencies.
I think what I enjoyed about it is that it was a complete departure from the Book of Negroes, in that you were writing in thriller format, in a kind of page turner way. You know, whereas with your other work, you had different aspirations, but it still had such success. I think it ended up winning on Canada Reads as well, in the year after it was published. But I know that we're sort of coming close to our time, but I wanted to ask you about what's next. What's on the horizon for you as far as books?
Thanks, David. Well, I'm still working on a long-suffering novel, which I still very much care for, but it's just taken more time than I care to admit, about the Alaska Highway. And very briefly, thousands of African-American soldiers during the Second World War were brought from the Deep South, from military bases in the Deep South of the United States, up into northern BC and Yukon and Alaska to build the 1,500-mile, Alaska Highway during the Second World War as a means to ward off an anticipated invasion of Japanese, who it was feared that they would attack Alaska and then come marauding down the continent. And so very few people know this, but we have thousands of African-American soldiers in the far north of Canada in the coldest winter on record in the Yukon, building the Alaska Highway through these incredibly brutal conditions of minus 40 or 50 degree weather. And so it's an incredible story of Black people in the far north invading the lands of Indigenous people as they are carrying out their instructions. So that's a novel that I've been working on for a while called The Midnight Men. And I've just finished several drafts of, and have one more draft I think to do, of a children's novel for 9 to 13-year-olds, which is a new venture for me. And it's been a lot of fun. I felt a lot of joy writing the children's novel about a tempestuous relationship between a 9-year-old Black girl. Actually, no, she's about 12. The readers are 9 to 13. But a 12-year-old Black girl and a 700-pound crocodile that wishes to eat her. And they have to get past this initial threat and forge an unusual friendship and then go on a journey. I love a road story.
Can't wait to read that. And my daughter is looking forward to it. I've told her about it already. Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you, Lawrence, for the conversation today. Thanks to everyone watching at home. I think there are links to buy the books on the Toronto International Festival of Authors webpage, courtesy of University of Toronto Bookstore, our exclusive online bookseller for this year's festival. And also thanks again to all of our Brazilian friends, Flup, the literary festival of the peripheries in Brazil. We'd like to encourage viewers to follow the festival on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fest of Authors. To learn more about our events, also encourage everyone to join the mailing list. It's been great to see you again virtually, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon.
And I can't wait to read Beatrice and Croc Harry when it comes out.
It won't be long. I really appreciate it. And it's great to see you again. And we'll continue to collaborate going forward, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's what we had to mention. Stay tuned. There is a spin-off of the Book of Negroes currently in development. So more to follow in that space.
Thank you.